He is one of the OGs and the legends of the game, a UFC Hall of Famer, and of course, one of the members of the commentary broadcast team for the PFL as the PFL playoffs are going on. Big PFL pay-per-view coming up in October. It is always my great pleasure to speak to Randy Couture. Randy, how are you?
I'm doing great, man. How are you doing?
I'm fantastic, man. Thank you for taking time for me as always. We always talk, a couple times during the season, but man, talk about a big time for PFL right now. Not only are we in the midst of playoffs, but this huge pay-per-view card just got announced coming up in October. Francis Ngannou's coming back. Chris Cyborg making her debut. I know the playoffs are happening, but you got to be excited about this pay-per-view.
Yeah, well, I'm excited about the pay-per-view too. Very excited to see Francis in the smart cage finally and back in MMA. I was at his Tyson Fury boxing match in Riyadh, and it was incredible, and it was an incredible experience. And he's I think definitely made a mark on this sport with how he stood up for himself to the biggest promotion in the sport, how he's done in the boxing world, chasing that dream of being being a boxer, and I think arguably one of the top now in both MMA, and some think he's ranked in the top 10 in boxing, which is pretty incredible all by itself. But to see him face Renan Pereira, who has really come into his own, winning the championship last year, moving to top team, kind of shoring up some of his wrestling and some of the weaknesses that we'd seen in him when he's so athletic and so explosive at 6'8", is just remarkable. And how is Francis going to solve that problem? Here's one of the guys that's one of the hardest punchers in our sport. But can he get close enough to that 6'8" giant to actually crack him? There's the question. And it's going to be a great fight. And then, Cyborg has literally won a championship in every promotion she's ever entered. Now she's finally in the PFL. I think everybody wanted to see her and Kayla, but Kayla's gone to the UFC. So Pacheco has won it 2 times in 2 divisions. She beat Kayla before Kayla left. That is going to be a barn burner for sure. If there's anybody that can strike as hard as Cyborg does, it's probably Larissa Pacheco. So that's going to be a really, really good fight. And I know they're building an amazing card to go under those 2 amazing fights.
Absolutely. I remember we talked before Francis had to fight with Anthony Joshua, I think it was. And I was legitimately concerned, like, is he going to come back? Because he did so well in that Tyson Fury fight, and there were just so many opportunities for him in boxing. And certainly you and I know that, when it comes to the sport, you got to make money, and that's a lot of payday for him. But you said, you told me back then, you're confident he's coming back. You were confident he was going to fight MMA again. I don't know that the Anthony Joshua fight, one way or the other made that decision for him, but because, again, I think he was probably always going to come back. But how big is this moment for Francis? Because when we last saw him in MMA, he was the number 1 heavyweight in the sport, beat Cyril Gane. He was the UFC heavyweight champion, number 1 ranked guy in the world. But how this sport goes, Randy, out of sight, out of mind. You're only as good as your last fight. And his last fight in MMA was a couple of years ago. So how big is this for Francis to come out there, just kind of remind people, like, who he is and what he meant to the sport of MMA? Because we've all kind of focused on boxing. We kind of forget, not forget, but we've kind of been out of sight with him, of he's the number 1 heavyweight in our sport.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. This is a huge fight for Francis for exactly those reasons. I don't think anybody's forgot him, but we haven't seen him fight. And then to see him go out against Fury and get a 3rd round knockout knocked down rather. And some people thought he won that fight, but I don't think Tyson was taking it terribly serious until he got knocked on his butt in the 3rd round. That's how I felt about it, and I was there. And I think then going into the Joshua fight, I think Francis maybe had a little false sense of his abilities and security and how good he is in boxing to do that well against Tyson Fury, who's arguably the best boxer we've seen in quite a while in the heavyweight division. So Joshua's coming off of a big win. Going into that fight, he took Francis very seriously, and I think everybody was going to after seeing him knock Fury down in the 3rd round. You have to take that seriously. He's got that kind of power. So Joshua was fired on all cylinders and did what Anthony Joshua does. It was, everybody's like, oh, it was a phantom punch. He did. Eric was there. He said, dude, I heard that punch land. Whoever made this video doctored it, because there's no way that punch didn't hit Francis. And Francis is a man of his word. He signed a contract with the PFL. The PFL put him in this position to be the chairman of the board for PFL Africa, to develop opportunities and create infrastructure for a lot of athletes that were just like him in Cameroon that have no place to go, no place to ply their wares, and really take their dream of being a professional athlete and a world champion to the next level. And that meant a lot to Francis. And in that same regard, that's why I knew he was going to come back to MMA. He wasn't just going to let that go. That's who he danced with to get him in this position in the first place. And you never leave the one, always dance with the one that brung you.
Absolutely. To that point, though, Randy, like when he was, his last couple of fights in the UFC, I mean, when he fought Stipe was the guy who beat him and beat him pretty dominantly when they fought the first time. So there's a threat there. At the time he fought Cyril Gane, Cyril was on this huge run, knockouts, flashy knockouts, spinning wheel kicks, all these kind of things. And they had trained together. So it was kind of a storyline. This time coming in, I think we got to be honest, Randy, like Renan Pereira is a beast, but he does kind of slip under the radar. He's not the guy who has the biggest name. He's not the guy who has all the rankings, but that to me is always one of the most dangerous fights you can have, because here's a 6'8" monster. I mean, listen, I'll be the first to admit it. I picked Ryan Bader to beat him because I thought the wrestling would give him problems, because Ryan's such a good wrestler. Even though Ryan's not a big heavyweight, it's like the wrestling is like the counter to what Renan does. Boy, was I wrong. Renan went out there and knocked him out in, what it was, a minute flat. How dangerous is this fight for Francis, though? Because Renan's not that guy. He's not the guy that everyone knows. He's not a household name. He's not a guy who has this established, 10-year career where we're like, man, this is one of the best. He's kind of an up-and-comer guy. So this is a dangerous fight for Francis.
It absolutely is a dangerous fight. And I think the big thing with Renan is changing camps. He moved from Brazil, where he was doing his camps, and he had some clear, glaring weaknesses that the guys like Verdum and others pointed out. Didn't always show up. And I think moving to Top Team, working there with Silveira, with Conan, who's a legend in the sport, had shored up a bunch of that. It got between his ears, and he shows up, and he's ready to go, and he's prepared now. There's no doubt in his mind that he deserves to be there. Technically, they shored up some of that grappling and wrestling so he can sprawl, keep the fight where he wants to, keep it standing, and use those long levers, those knees, those front kicks, those long punches that he's taken so many guys out with to get to that title run last season. So, yeah, nobody knows who he is now because he's been fighting in the PFL, brand new organization. It's only been on the market for 6 years now. So I think they're going to know him, and they're certainly going to know him after this fight with Francis, because it's going to be a very, very interesting, very good fight. He poses some problems for Francis to solve. Francis has got to now rely on this new wrestling ability that he spent since that first Stipe fight to develop. And that's why he came to Extreme Couture, to become better at that part of his game. But traditionally, he's used that in a defensive posture to make guys stand with it. It'll be interesting to see now if we shift gears a little bit and use that wrestling in an offensive place to put Renan Pereira at 6'8" on his back and make him fight from his back, tie him up in the clinch, put him on the cage, take those legs out from underneath him, and not play those range of exchanges, those at distance with a guy that big and that powerful. It'll be interesting. I am not part of that process with Francis, and that's him and Eric cooking up that game plan and how to solve those problems. And I haven't heard what their game plan is yet. Not that I would disclose that here, but that's the interesting, intriguing part for me, is how do you solve that problem? Maybe he's not a household name at this point, but I think he's headed into being a household name at some point. Is he going to do that by beating Francis, or is that going to be somebody else down the line? There's that's the potential that this fight has.
We are sadly in this sport kind of quick to forget, and as I said, with Francis kind of being in boxing and being gone from MMA for a couple of years, we kind of forget. And right now the conversation is circling around, John Jones, John Jones is a legend. We all know John Jones is a legend. There's no doubt about it. And Tom Aspinall's been doing some great things in the UFC, but I think a lot of people have kind of forgotten when Francis left, he was the UFC heavyweight champion, didn't lose the title, basically gave it up to leave the organization and sign with PFL. And he was by far, there was zero doubt, he was the number one heavyweight in our sport. Do you feel like this is a moment for Francis to kind of send that message back to people to say, hey, I'm not in the UFC anymore, but I'm still the number one heavyweight in our sport? Because that conversation right now, everyone's John Jones, Tom Aspinall, John Jones, Tom Aspinall. I get it, but we got to remember where Francis Ngannou was when he last fought in MMA.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely correct. You're spot on. This is a huge fight for Francis for a whole bunch of reasons. Getting back into the cage, shoring up that wrestling, sharpening those tools. And MMA is a different engagement than boxing is. And anybody that can't see that now is missing the point. But I think he's putting it on the line. He's willing to step up there and do that. I don't think he's scared of anybody. So yeah, I think all those things come into play. The UFC is still the biggest promotion in this sport, and that's why everybody's talking about those two heavyweights instead of the PFL right now, or that pay-per-view that's coming up in the PFL in October. So, we still have ground to cover, and we're headed in the right direction. Aspinall and John Jones would be an amazing fight, and they need to put it on the line, settle that, and unify those titles, and fight, make it happen.
I talk,
I think with full transparency, maybe we can create those champions versus champions fights. I know the UFC's got too big an ego to let that happen. That's why the Fedor fight never happened, because M1 wanted to do a co-promotion, and the UFC's never going to let that happen. So I don't see the champ from the UFC ever getting a shot in fighting the champ from PFL or any other organization for that matter. And that's unfortunate. And that's a shame that the fans are never going to get to see those type of matchups. And that's one of the flaws and issues in our sport right now.
I feel like I know the answer. It's funny you were going there because I talked to Dan Hardy a couple of months ago, and we were talking about Francis coming back, and we were talking about the Jones fight. And there was the interesting thing that happened recently with Turki Al-Sheikh. Turki Al-Sheikh's out there kind of saving boxing right now, putting a lot of money into it, giving us fights. We want to see fights that a lot of people are like, we thought we would maybe never see Fury and Usyk, and they finally got it happening. Now they're doing it again. And I remember when Dana was doing it, and Turki brought up, he mentioned like doing the cross promotion, bringing over Francis, and Dana didn't shut it down. Now maybe it was just, he was just in front of Turki and all that kind of stuff, but we all know how money works in sport. And now, listen, I'm not saying Dana's not in charge. Dana is in charge, but Dana now has bosses. He does, like it or not. Like, somebody owns the UFC, and it's not Lorenzo Fertitta. Do you see any world where, a guy like Turki Al-Sheikh can come in, and obviously, PFL has a relationship with Saudi Arabia. UFC now has a relationship with Saudi Arabia. Do you think there's a world where that guy could come in and say, look, we do want to make Francis and John Jones, or is there just a zero? Is it even pointless to even bring it up because we know Dana's going to work so hard to make it not happen?
Yeah, I don't know. At the end of the day, I think Ari's still the one calling the shots. He's the one that bought the company from Zuffa, and it's his business. He has shareholders and people that he has to answer to, and needs to do what's best for the bottom line for that company, for Takedown. That includes the WWE and the UFC and everything that's going on there. So, and certainly the PIF and what the Saudis are holding and what they're doing with Live Golf and all the other things that they're maneuvering to build culture and create opportunity for their citizens and their athletes in their country, that could very well happen, because that kind of money can make a lot of things happen. Who builds an arena like that one they built in 3 months? I mean, that was remarkable to be in that place. It was state of the art and an incredible experience to be at the Ngannou Tyson Fury fight. And that was because of Turki, for sure.
Yeah.
The guy's amazing and what he wants to accomplish. It's incredible.
And I remember you saying like what a great experience that was, which is why I said like it just seems like that guy can move mountains. Maybe it's possible. Like maybe it's a pipe dream. But like I said, I just think like if we're talking about the biggest fight in the sport right now, I think we all agree it would probably be Francis and John Jones. That is the biggest fight we could do in the sport right now. And I just like I wish we could see it happen. Maybe that guy's got the magic the magic to pull out of the hat there. Can I ask you, Randy, not getting too far off subject with PFL, but speaking of that, because you mentioned the UFC, I know we've had a lot of conversations about changes that need to happen in this sport and some things that are going on. I know, of course, you've always kept a close eye on the antitrust lawsuit that was going on with the UFC and the fighters and things like that. Kind of an unprecedented move recently where the judge basically said, no, we're not going to do this settlement. It's not enough. I don't feel comfortable with some of the contract issues, things like that. And he shut it down. I know you're not living front and center with that, but can I get your opinion on like what you thought of that and where we stand with that? Because I know you were at the forefront of like battling for fighters to have more rights, and that was a big part of the antitrust lawsuit. That wasn't part of the settlement, though. The settlement was basically money more than anything else.
Yeah, well, and that's exactly the elephant in the room. Where's the injunctive relief? The whole idea for taking this on 10 years ago and spending all this time and money of these 3 law firms that do class actions was to change the way the company has to do business. And there's no injunctive relief wrapped up in closing this deal out. And I think that was a big issue why the judge didn't stamp off on it. $335 million seems like a lot of money on at face value. But if you look at the athletes in that class, it's a huge class of athletes over that time period. That $335 million isn't going to go that far. It probably should have been in the billions, 1 or 2 billion, to cover those athletes appropriately for the money they potentially could have made in that time frame. And no injunctive relief is the real issue. Why do we do this? Why did all these athletes put their name and likeness on the line here, basically, to fight the biggest promotion in the sport if they're not forced to change the way they do businesses, eliminate these restrictive contracts, create some transparency in our sport so that promoters have to disclose how much money they're making off those fighters that fight on those cards. Now those fighters have an opportunity to negotiate their fair value in the marketplace. That is the flaw in our sport right now. We have no way of knowing how much. Until they sold that company for $4.2 billion, the fighters had no clue. And that was the first big red flag, aside from me chirping in 2006 about their crappy contracts and ancillary rights and the restrictive nature of them. And there were crickets back then. Nobody said a thing. But when that sold for $4.2 billion, that got everybody's attention. And all the fighters started to recognize and realize through the class action and through all these other fighters starting to chirp, including John Jones and Francis Ngannou, about fighter pay, and Jake Paul poking Dana in the chest because of these crossover fights, and guys making more money than they ever made in MMA on their very first boxing match. I mean, that's crazy, but that's exactly what's happening. And there's the growing pains and the issues in our sport. We need that transparency desperately. The fastest way to get there is to amend the Ali Act to cover all combative sports athletes, not just boxers. That would get us there very, very quickly. Eliminate these restrictive contracts, force the promoters to disclose how much money they make on any given event. The fighters can then negotiate their fair value in the marketplace. That's the fastest way to get there. The next fastest is this class action lawsuit. And the thing that's missing is that injunctive relief, forcing them to do business differently. That's it right there.
So can I imagine, I feel like I know the answer, can I imagine when they go back to the table? Because in my opinion, Randy, this is never going to go to trial. I don't think the UFC can risk that. There's just too much. And I think, listen, anytime you go to trial, there's a risk. You get, depending how the jury sees things, they could rule for the UFC, they could rule against the UFC, and that becomes disaster. That's why almost every antitrust lawsuit ends in a settlement. This is not UFC, this is like across the world. Can I imagine your opinion, like when they go back to the table and they get a settlement, that some element of that has to be in there? Is that, I imagine your opinion, like that injunctive release, something has to be in there?
I think there has to be some change in the way that the company does business. And then I think that's what, at the end of the day, what this was really all about. It wasn't about money. It was about the business practices of the company. So if that's not in there some way, shape, or form to create a little bit of that transparency and change their contracts and the way they do business, then we're missing the boat. And yeah, I think as they come back to the table to negotiate so it doesn't go to court, because there's obviously a reason they sanctioned the class and they rated the class and made it worthy. There's obviously some merit there. You got 3 of the biggest class action firms in the world that have been chasing this and spending their own time and money to make this happen for the last 10 years. So there's something there for sure. And the UFC certainly knows that. So it'll be interesting to see how it shakes out. Looks like we're looking at a date here in October for a court. And I'm sure they'll be coming to the negotiation table to probably try to find a way to avoid that as it gets closer. But who knows?
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll see how it all plays out. Going back to PFL, Randy, of course, I mentioned the pay-per-view. And again, I don't want to get lost in the playoffs, but this pay-per-view card's so big, I could not mention it. Of course, Chris Cyborg is a legend. I think we all know what Chris Cyborg means to this sport, but Chris has been very vocal about she's kind of coming towards the end of her MMA career. She's been out doing boxing matches and things like this. Larissa Pacheco has been on such a dominant run over these last couple of years, especially, and I think it was a statement made beating Kayla Harrison the way she did, because I think you and I both agree Kayla Harrison is very, very good. To go out there and beat Kayla was an incredible accomplishment, and she's been, dominating ever since then. Is there a world where like this could be like, I just read a story recently around Ronda Rousey, like passing of the torch in a way, because when Ronda lost to Holly Holm and then eventually to Amanda Nunes, that was almost like her. I mean, of course she didn't want to lose, but like that was her handing over the reins. Cyborg did it with Gina Carano. Gina was the biggest star in the world. You know Gina very well. She beat Gina.
I was calling Gina for that fight.
Yeah, so that's how this sport works. Like that's how this sport works. Is there a world where you could see this being, if there's a changing of the guard, so to speak, this could be Larissa's chance to kind of take that next step because Chris is, if not the greatest, at worst one of the top 2 or 3 greatest women's fighters ever.
Yeah, I think you've mentioned them all already. Gina Carano, the first queen of this sport in mixed martial arts for sure. She got beat by Cyborg, which put Cyborg's name in that position. Then Ronda Rousey came along. Now I never saw Ronda and Cyborg fight. I would have loved to have seen that fight. That would have been very, very cool as well. But I think you're correct. There's a possibility that there's a passing of the torch here. You can never count Cyborg out. I don't think she's going to go in there and smash Larissa. If there's somebody that can stand in front of Chris Cyborg, it's Larissa Pacheco. And she's proven that. Her journey through this PFL has been remarkable to watch. And Kayla was a big impetus and the gas on that fire for her to do all that work and shore up those parts of her game and really improve herself to be able to go out there and beat Kayla the way she did. Kayla is still, in my opinion, one of the best females in this sport, maybe the best female in this sport. The judo gold medals and all the things that she brought to the table, the diligence, the hard work, the team that she has with Matt Brown and everything else that's going on down there. She's still, for my money, pound for pound, the best female fighter right now. I think Chris is coming over the top, but she's still very, very tough. And Larissa has an opportunity to put her name on that list of top female fighters in the world. Everybody will know her after this fight on October 19th, for sure, no matter how it goes.
Yeah, it's a huge opportunity for her. And again, I think beating Kayla is such a huge deal because she has that feather in her cap now. She's the only one. I agree with you. I think Kayla is, I have her ranked number 1 on my rankings for bantamweight. I mean, I think beating Holly Holm, the one win she got, I was like, yep, that's number 1 for me. I mean, Kayla's a monster. But again, I think Larissa beating her, I mean, I know that's going to be a big part going into this because Kayla and Cyborg were going to fight well. Now you get to fight the one who beat Kayla, the only person to beat Kayla. So it is a super intriguing matchup. And Chris has not been doing MMA. I mean, she's been doing boxing. And as well as I do, it's muscle memory. You get away from it, things change a little bit. Now, of course, Chris is a legend. She's been around the sport forever. But, getting back in MMA. And I've heard so many people, this, Randy, because you're around training all the time, guys who switch into boxing or doing everything. It's like, man, I don't put my body through as much just doing boxing training because you're not wrestling, you're not grappling. It's a hard workout to go through an MMA workout. These are little things that I think can play a factor coming up in October.
Yeah, they absolutely can. You're absolutely correct. It's a different kind of cardiovascular and aerobic capacity to be able to wrestle. It's a different thing. It's one of the few sports where you use both of those systems at the same time in MMA and wrestling. You're using your aerobic capacity, and that's that running and conditioning shape, but you're also using your anaerobic ability to push against a resisting opponent for the entire 25 minutes of a fight is a whole different animal. And you're correct. Those will absolutely be factors for Chris as she sharpens those tools. She's got plenty of time, though. She's going to dust off the grappling and the wrestling. And if I'm Larissa Pacheco, I'm looking at that too. I'm going to find a way to put Chris Cyborg on her back and make her fight from there, make her scramble, make her work, make her grapple more. I'm not going to stand and just see who's got the toughest punch. I think that'd be a silly approach. You might come out on the right end, but you also might come out on the wrong end of that. And I don't like those odds. So, I mean, if I'm Larissa Pacheco, I'm definitely thinking about how to put her in that world and take away her strength, that size and that power that she brings to every single fight.
It's funny. You were talking about all the work you do in MMA. A couple of months ago, I did an interview with Sean Merriman, the former NFL player. He was talking about getting into MMA, and he mentioned you. He's like, I went out to LA, and it was Jake Glazer. He's like, I met Randy Couture, and he's like, yeah, he's a big dude, big guy, linebacker, defensive end. He's like, and Randy was tossing me around like I was a child, and I was just like, he's like, that's when he fell in love with MMA. He's like, I thought I was this big, muscular, athletic guy, and Randy Couture's tossed me around like a child. He's like, that was a wake up call how good MMA is. So it's a whole other world with this sport.
Sean's a great guy. I see him in the gym all the time. He's definitely a dedicated athlete and dedicated to MMA. He loves the sport. So not surprised he's interested in trying his hand, because the truth is you never know until you walk up in there. You just don't know. So he's as athletic as they come. I hope he does it. I think he'll be happy. He'll be pleasantly surprised and happy he did it. But he's a great guy. I see him all the time. That's a funny story.
I love it. Before I get you out of here, Randy, one last thing I want to touch on, because obviously, again, playoffs going on. I'm actually talking to Dakota Dacheva tomorrow. She's an incredible. I think she's got a chance to become the next star. Of course, Tyler Santos, no joke. That's a super hard fight for her in the finals. Obviously, Brendan Lockton. A lot of things going on. But this press conference that's happening with Francis and Cyborg and everyone, it's being hosted by our guy Jake Paul. Of course, Jake Paul, part of the PFL. Now, Randy, like it or not, I'm sure you still appreciate it. Like anytime we ever talk about anyone fighting over the age of 40, we always talk about Randy Couture as the gold model. You were one of the only guys to fight past 40, but not fight past 40, fight at a championship level past 40. You were a champion past 40. You found a way to do it. You were the fountain of youth, so to speak. Can I ask you, like, what you make of Jake in this Mike Tyson fight, and what kind of a chance do you give Mike Tyson? Because at his best, at his peak, Mike Tyson was one of the scariest people on earth. But we can't ignore the fact that Mike Tyson's 58 years old, and that's just a different animal than 58. But like you found the fountain of youth. You were still kicking people's asses in your 40s when people said guys shouldn't be able to do that. You were doing that in the UFC at the highest level. Now, I'm not trying to insult Jake Paul. I don't think we're going to put Jake Paul in the same level as like an Anthony Joshua. It's not like Tyson's fighting Anthony Joshua. But do you give Mike Tyson a chance to do this, or what does he need?
I absolutely give him a chance. If you've seen any of the training footage that's coming out of his camps and stuff, and I don't know what the gastrointestinal issues were that derailed that fight happening in August, but I absolutely, you'd be crazy not to give Mike Tyson a chance. First of all, this is a way more settled and way more grounded Mike Tyson than we've ever seen, even when he was in his prime. So that goes a long way. That mentality is a huge piece of it. And why did he come undone when he was in his prime? Because of this, not because of the physical part of the game. So I think you're dealing with a much sounder, much more grounded Mike Tyson right now. He knows how to do the work, the physical part. 58 is just a number. I'm not worried about that at all. I'm a little more worried about whatever's going to be in that contract that he signs with Jake Paul to do this fight. Are they going to handcuff him and not let him go out there and just do a boxing match and let the chips fall where they may? I'm hearing inklings of no knockout clauses and some of these things in these contracts with Jake, and that's a little concerning. Are we really doing prize fighting and fighting here, or is this a show? Is this an exhibition? And there's a big difference. I mean, if you look at Gotti's fighting Mayweather again this weekend in a boxing exhibition. Why? Because Mayweather certainly doesn't want to put that O on the line and give John Gotti a chance to take that away from him. So he's going to do an exhibition. That's not prize fighting. That's not the same thing. Those guys don't even look like they're fighting when they match up and get in that ring. It's not the same thing. So we got to call it exactly how it is. Does Mike have a chance to go out and knock Jake Paul out? Absolutely. If he's not handcuffed to a title that's not going to allow him to go out and do that and fight the way he wants to fight. That's the question I have with it. Do I think Jake Paul's going to make a good showing for himself? Absolutely. He's done that. He did that against Fury. He was a real legit fighter, a legit boxer. His other fights, he chose strategically wrestlers and grapplers that came from the MMA world that had marquee names, but were either coming over the top physically and not firing on all cylinders the way we're used to seeing them fire, or, there was more going on there. Who knows? But those guys still made more money in those boxing matches than they ever made in MMA. And that's exactly why Jake Paul was poking Dana White in the chest about that. Well, you take care of your fighters better, pay them better. So I'll get behind Jake Paul all day long. He's doing all the right things. He's shining a light on some of the issues in our sport. Obviously, he's helping us in the PFL continue to grow this brand. And he's backed it up. He's stepped in there and he's backed it up pretty consistently. So, I think Mike Tyson is a huge ass for anybody. That dude is as explosive at 58 as anybody that we've seen. So he absolutely has the shot to go out there and end this whole thing with Jake Paul.
Well, Randy, I know you're still in shape and still working. If Jake decides he wants to ask you to come out of retirement for his first MMA fight, I will auction off everything I've ever owned to bet on you to win that fight. I'm just saying, if it happens, I'm just saying, I may not have the same confidence in Mike Tyson right now, but I will auction off everything I own and put all the money on Randy Couture to win that fight.
Well, that would be interesting. Yeah, set a new record. 61-year-old with his walker making his way to the cage.
I think you would get to that case, chuck that Walker, and go in there and thump Jake Paul. That's all I'm saying, Randy. That's all I'm saying. Randy, it's always a pleasure to catch up, man. You're one of the greatest minds in our sport. I really appreciate the time. Obviously, have fun calling the playoffs coming up. Some great matchups in the PFL. I can't wait for this pay-per-view again. I don't want to look past the playoffs, but we can't not get excited about this pay-per-view in October. Thank you as always for the time. I really appreciate it and look forward to catching up again soon.
Thanks, man. Appreciate you having me on. Be well. Have a great day.